as much as we like to think that we are rational decision makers, we are not. We are emotional decision makers. The work should not be the definition of the human. If you can actually feel like your work matters, it doesn't really feel like work. It feels like you're solving interesting problems with your buddies. And that is a very fulfilling way to work. And it will also do a collective societal good.
Shayne, I'm very excited to have you on the Core Impact podcast. I was fascinated by the topics that we talked about in the TOU in the university and curious to know more from you. But let me start with the first question with your why. What is your why? What is your passion and what inspires you to do what you are doing?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really happy to be here. The one that TOU helped me formulate is to nurture the sustainability ecosystem. Easier to think of it than to say it. So basically what that means to me is we have all sorts of people trying to do all these different efforts, and they can be in conflict with one another. They can clash with one another, or maybe, have two groups that could really benefit from knowing each other, but they don't find each other. So how do we help bring that together? How do we help these people find each other, to work together, to multiply their value or even exponentialize their value? So that's really what kind of drives me. I view myself as a connector, and I've done that through my career in various different aspects of it, as well as in personal life. And being able to do that for the broader community, for the sustainability community, for people who are driving innovation, trying to make the world better, and for us to work better together, that's something that gives me a great deal of passion.
As I ask my guests about their why, I also like to share mine. Why I started the Core Impact podcast. After working across companies, cities, and cultures, I kept noticing the same pattern. Most people around me were burned out, disengaged, and only lived for the weekend. I also experienced it myself. I went through a burnout, and I knew since then that I couldn't come back to the same patterns and mindset. What I've learned since, from connecting with experts and personal experiences, is that small shifts in routines and mindset can dramatically reduce stress and lead to more fulfilling work. That's why I created this podcast, to explore how can we build workplaces that are joyful, meaningful, and sustainable from the inside out, where profit meets purpose, because real impact starts at the core. Shayne, one of the topics that we focused on during what you were lecturing, the challenge, is non-judgmental thinking. And before we dive deep into it, can you explain in simple words, what does that mean? How can you practically not judge? Like how you can be in workplace, for example, without saying this is good or bad?
Yeah. No, that's a funny thing, because as you know, going through the class, you can't. The reality is we're all judgmental. The thing is, how do we end up finding a balance between what our brains naturally do, the judgments our brains naturally do, and how we actually choose to react and respond to them? Our brains will naturally make snap judgments. It's a survival mechanism. It is critical that they do this. However, those snap judgments aren't necessarily telling the full story. So, is it non-judgmental thinking? I don't know if the class is exactly named perfectly for the reality. However, it's more along the lines of showing that you're able to approach a topic from a non-judgmental perspective. You're still being judgmental, but now, hopefully, when you come through the class, you have the tools to recognize, oh, wait a minute, that's my bias speaking. That's not really what my deeper reasoning shows me.
Do you have a real story where non-judgmental thinking shifted a team conflict into collaboration?
Quite a few. It's just a question of choosing which. This was before the time of crafting the class, so it's more raw from a workplace sort of situation. But one of the things I regularly came into in my role as an Agile coach, which I did for about 10 years, thereabouts, you'd run into teams in high levels of conflict. You'd see the engineers don't like the developers, and nobody trusts the designers, or certainly not the project manager, etc. This is a common thing that happens. So one of the stories that comes to mind is we were putting together a group. I think it started at about 50 people, if I recall correctly. So it was a set of three engineering teams plus management and design, etc. So a very diverse set of people. And they very easily could have been at each other's throats in minutes. They all identified differently. They were all, actually, when this group started, they didn't actually have a office location, so they were working out of conference rooms for real. So they were displaced, competing over resources, all of the different fundamentals, which tends to drive a group to conflict. But what they were able to do, and I was part of helping get them to this, was focus on their core mission, why they were there, which in the case of this one, major financial services organization, they were working on helping retirees who may struggle with using the internet and such to make sure that they didn't incur heavy fines. So it's something that just about everybody on that team could say, oh, my parents, oh my goodness, they have a hard time using a mouse. How could they navigate this really tough financial services website? So everybody ended up embracing and internalizing the mission that the company was seeking to do. And through that, they were able to create a product that was actually clear, understandable, and that the customers absolutely loved. And while there were conflicts in the group, it was, well, I wouldn't say easy, but it was very possible to bring them back to, hey, we're focusing on this mission. Everybody agreed to that mission. And this is a key that transcends just work experience, but generally with humans, is that if we have something that aligns us, we don't have to like each other to work well together. We can truly not stand each other and still work well together as long as we respect one another and what each other offers. So a common thing, this is all based on psychological safety. The work of Dr. Amy Edmondson is fantastic on that subject. She's the biggest voice in the area. And one of the things people miss about psychological safety is it's not about being nice. In fact, often quite the opposite. It's about being able to very openly and transparently share your doubts, share your criticisms, your critiques, and everybody can actually speak honestly. And this is a foundation of any effective team. So this again ties into why it's so critically important to have that common guiding mission, because then you can align everybody around it and saying, hey, we don't like each other, but we can show up and we care about the same thing. So I'm willing to work with you and give you the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. We're not going to get lunch together, but we're going to still work together towards this shared goal. So, of course, it's better when people do like each other, and that's what you hope to get to, but it's not necessary. It's the respect and the common mission is really what's key.
Perfect. So once you have, as a team, you have a clear intention, a clear mission, then it would be easier to manage all these conflicts. And then people will forget about these conflicts and they will focus more on the goal of why are they doing what they are doing, right?
Well, I wouldn't say they forget about the conflicts, but yeah, I mean, it still needs to be managed, but you're more likely to be able to move the conflict to constructive. And here's another key point, and I think this talks to Edmondson's work. There's also somebody by the name of Speed Lees who identified levels of conflict. Conflict is not bad and is not something to be avoided. In fact, Patrick Lencioni, in his work, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, talks about lack of conflict being a dysfunction of the team. Conflict is essential to doing actually good generative work. Reason being is none of us have all the answers, as much as we want to think we do. None of us do. So how do we get to some truth or forward momentum? Well, we find a way to say, well, Omar, I see where you're coming from, but that doesn't exactly fit my experience. And now if we're both open to that sort of an exchange, now we can maybe come to something closer to the truth. I think there's a parable of the 6 blind monks and an elephant, if I recall correctly. I think it's from Indian perspective, Indian thought. But basically, 6 blind monks find an elephant. One of them has a leg. It's like, well, clearly this is a tree. Another one has a trunk. Well, it's a vine. Another one has the belly. It's like, oh, it's a wall. None of them on their own can tell it's an elephant. But working together, they can probably put together that image. And I probably butchered that parable, but it is still a really important learning. None of us have a complete perspective. It's absolutely impossible in the level of complexity we're dealing with for anybody to see the entire picture. Only working together can we, and the way to do that is through constructive conflict.
Do you have also a practical example, either for CEOs or even any professional? How can we be less judgmental in a daily working life?
The key there is empathy. And I'm not talking about empathy of, oh, I feel what you feel. I'm talking about empathy of, I understand where you're coming from. So there's a wonderful book by a guy by the name of Chris Voss called Never Split the Difference. And he teaches business negotiation. He's the former head of US FBI hostage negotiation, international hostage negotiation. And now he teaches business negotiation. And one of his core messages is the most important thing in a negotiation is understanding where the other person's coming from and drawing them out through conversation. If you don't start with the basis of understanding where the person's coming from, and even more importantly, and maybe misquoting him a little bit, so I'm going to try to fix that, is having the other person know that you understand where they're coming from. Because there's one thing that's like, oh yeah, I get you. And you might be thinking in your head, do you? Do you really? But if I can express that, so, wow, it sounds like you're feeling really uncomfortable about this. And you're like, yeah, it is. So it's using some conversational tools to draw the other person out and understand their perspective. What it allows you to do is to start to find a way that you can work together towards a common goal, which is really the key. When we're in a conflict, if I need to prove I'm right and you're wrong, that's just going to escalate. That's going to get really gnarly. But if instead we say, hey, Omar, you and I, we agree we want to do this. We agree this is really important to both of us. So how do we find a way to work together towards this? Now, why are you going to believe me if I just come straight in and say that? But if I say, okay, so help me understand. It sounds like you think our best approach is doing X, Y, Z. And from my perspective, it's Z, Y, X. So how do we reconcile that? It changes the entire nature of the conversation. And now, instead of me saying, you're wrong, your view is wrong, or even, oh, I know what you're thinking, and this is what we should do instead, it turns it into, hey, I'm really trying to understand where you're coming from here, and this is what I think it is. And if I get it wrong, then you say, oh, no. You thought I said ZYX. I was actually saying ABC. So it allows you an opportunity to correct my perception of what you were saying. And then from there, we have a basis of truth that we can use to continue to solve this common problem we both agree on. Now, I will be very clear in saying it's easier to say that when we're thinking about it objectively from a conversation on, say, a podcast, for instance, than it is to do it in the moment. It's something that takes practice and repeated practice, because when emotions are high, we often forget that.
What can I do daily not to forget about it? You know what I mean? For example, listening to talk conversations like this, or just being aware of it as of whenever I see the conflict, then just having this knowledge will help me remember that this is the reason of this conflict. It's much easier to forget than to remember. Yeah. So how can we remember?
So it sounds like what we're trying to tease out here is, how do we embed this into our regular habits and do that on a regular basis. And by the way, I just did it because I'm now thinking about it. So that's saying it sounds like this. That allows you to say, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Okay, now I know where to go with this, so we have a better conversation. So how do we do this? Habit building is a key part of building any new practice in yourself. So habits, in a broad sense, are broken down into a trigger, an action you take, and some form of reward. Usually it's a sense of well-being or sense of satisfaction or something like that. And there might be other things if you dig deeper into it, but that's the basic structure of a habit. So if you're learning something new or trying to change your behavior, I find trying to intentionally determine a trigger. Like, for instance, I need to start getting in better shape. A lot of us do. One of the things I decided I'd do is I would start doing some calisthenics early in the morning when I wake up. I don't wake up early, but anyway, when I wake up. So now it has integrated into my morning wake up habits, and I'll sit there and I'll think about, I really don't want to do this. I don't like doing it. I don't want to do it. But it's now one of those things where I know if I do it, I have this almost compelling urge to do it because I've trained myself to do that. I do the thing, I suffer through it. And then afterwards, I reflect on that sense of well-being. Hey, I did that. I can go on the rest of my day knowing that I did that. So that's just a little bit of an example of something that you can bet in there, something I find unpleasant. Other people do find it pleasant. I find it unpleasant. But it's something that you can start doing that to build a habit. So how does this relate to your question about how do you build these in? Practice. Build a practice session into your day. Find a trigger that might cause you to do this. Then do something along those lines of, okay, hey, this is what I'm going to either do the reflection, this is what I'm going to do something to expand my knowledge. Then make sure you take the time, reward yourself, whether it's just like, hey, I did that thing, cool. Or maybe that's when you, I don't know, find something else. You enjoy taking walks or something, you take a walk. Something that just says, hey, I did this thing. And that reinforces it. And over time, that will just become part of what you do. A classic example from a lot of this habit building stuff I learned from The Power of Habit by John Doerr, if I recall correctly. And one of the examples he uses in there is a runner lacing up their shoes is a trigger. Oh, hey, I'm going to go on a run. And afterwards, they feel energized. They did the thing. So the same thing works for trying to build new mental habits, which we're talking about. Another thing that can be helpful, I know it has been in my previous attempts to get in shape, is having a buddy, having a sparring buddy, having a workout buddy or something to that effect. So if you want to practice this stuff, get somebody else who's interested in it as well and just start practicing. Then what Voss and his son, who also teaches his material, they do is they'll practice it on like hotel clerks and things like that, because what they're doing in the case of the negotiation aspect and the empathy, that's not something bad. That's actually a collective good. And you can see how it helps you continue to evolve your negotiation skills. And negotiation skills absolutely fit into working with an employee, fit into interacting with anybody in your organization or without.
If you are enjoying the Core Impact podcast and feel inspired, let's connect on LinkedIn. You can search for my name, Omar El Mamlouk, or click on the link in the description. I would love to hear your thoughts or collaborate on projects around mental health and well-being at workplace, inclusive leadership, inner leadership, and the future of work. Let's co-create impact together. Shayne, also, we learned the cognitive biases.
Yes.
What are the top 3 that you think they are very important, maybe people underestimate, and you can also give examples of each one of the 3, like explaining them, and if you have any story.
And then the reason I'm chuckling, it's like, only 3? There's over 300.
Yeah.
It's a very narrow field. Well, one of the biggest ones that we're all subject to, and unfortunately, it is just incredibly pervasive is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is we tend to dismiss stuff that we don't agree with and intentionally seek out stuff that we do agree with, which shapes our view of reality. So you can see this play out all over the internet. There's numerous cases. You could probably, if you self-reflect, you could say, oh yeah, I didn't read that news site because I don't like what they said. Instead, I'm going to read this thing. It doesn't really matter whether or not it's true. What matters is, does it reinforce my pre-existing beliefs or conflict with them? Because when it conflicts, it puts you in a very uncomfortable state called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance, we all want to avoid that. It's reality doesn't match our views. This is also a fundamental reason, and I'm a little tangenty here. It's a fundamental reason why none of us like to hear that we're wrong. So when we present people with data to say, here's the proof that you're wrong, people's brains will rebel against that naturally. And another thing, I think Voss talks about it, but a number of people do, is as much as we like to think that we are rational decision makers, we are not. We are emotional decision makers. So think about purchases you've made, big purchases. What drove that decision? Was it purely rational? We like to think it is. We collected all this data.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what made you make that decision? Probably an emotional trigger. How does it fit into that particular bias? Is we are going to look for data that supports our views. Anything that conflicts with our views, we're going to discount immediately. And confirmation bias, there we go. So confirmation bias, it affects all of us. Unfortunately, one of the disservices that search engines do, search engine optimization, a lot of the efforts there is just a massive electronic reinforcement of confirmation bias. And to be very transparent, I fear that that's where generative AI is taking us, is even more of that because of what it's being trained on. So that's the first one. Confirmation bias is probably the biggest, hairiest monster in the ring. Another one that comes to mind right off the bat is the curse of knowledge. So the curse of knowledge tends to play out when you think everybody has the same understanding of the world as you do. Because it makes perfect sense in your head. Obviously, it is absolutely obvious how quantum physics works. People should just know this. So when I'm talking about this thing, they should just get it. Why don't they get it? Are they dumb? And the reality is, you've built up this whole body of knowledge that the other person may not have the benefit of. So this goes back to, of course, empathy. And how do we draw out of the other person what they know? How do we help them understand? Now, something I struggle with, as I'm sure you picked up on, and I'm probably demonstrating here, is I give too much context to try to get people speed on that, which is another problem because that can cause cognitive overload. So how do you summarize stuff? How do you bring people along? Well, the key thing is, again, empathy, connecting with the people, understanding where they're coming from and what they need. It's not about what I need to say. It's about what the other person needs to hear. And let's see, third one. I'll just touch on this one because you see it crop up all the time, and that's survivorship bias. So survivorship bias, uncovered during the firestorm that was World War II, is the false belief that the few outliers who survive define the actual state of things. A classic example, less death-oriented, is Steve Jobs dropped out of college. So, therefore, college isn't particularly important. Now, the thing that you see Steve Jobs, tremendously successful, no doubt, absolute luminary. What you don't see is the millions and millions, if not more, people who dropped out of college and went nowhere. The outlier doesn't define, the incredibly impressive outlier doesn't define the actual odds of something happening. So our brain will naturally focus on that outlier because, hey, we want to be like that. That's really cool. But you've got to look at more of the picture to understand it. Now, that all said, entrepreneurship does require a certain level of survivorship bias to even attempt it in the first place. The vast majority of entrepreneurial ventures fail. That said, it's important to go in with a reasoned, clear-headed approach. If your effort is going to be successful or not, what is the firm basis of that reinforces that, rather than just like, oh yeah, totally, somebody did a business just like this, mine's going to work. You want to make sure you're grounded in reality and as much facts as you can. Your brain may be saying, no problem, I've got that. And that's not a bad thing. You got to have confidence as an entrepreneur. However, you need to be able to back those beliefs with something concrete and tangible.
Mm. Thank you, Shayne. When you started with the confirmation bias, I felt like, wow, yeah, because I've been reflecting on it and then see how important it is, especially now with the social media, with the search engine, with AI. So thank you for reflecting on this with me. Let's come now to the other thing that I'd like to talk about is the unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
How much professionals in daily work suffer from the unconscious bias without them knowing? Unconscious. How much is it important to be aware of it, and how can you recognize things that you're unconscious of, also with practices?
That's a big question. To answer the first bit of your question, I would say close to 100% are subject to it. We all are, because, well, the classic thing of a fish doesn't realize they're swimming in water. Our unconscious biases by nature are unconscious. It's just part of being normal. So in that case, we are all subject to them. Now, I think awareness of them is good and something you should develop. I think developing mechanisms to connect with other people, particularly people who are different than you, is probably a more important skill to develop. Find common ground with that teammate who is extremely different gender, different religion, whatever. Find some common ground, find something you agree with, and then find a way to build those bonds. That's going to probably take you a lot further. Now, if you do find yourself extremely interested in your unconscious bias, and it is worth exploring, there's a tool that is used by researchers to help people gauge their level of unconscious bias. It has you choose a topic that is often very emotionally charged. Could have to do with racial prejudice, could have to do with gun violence, a number of different things, religious, whatever. And it shows you pictures of people and has you choose about certain statements being true, certain characteristics being true or false. And it's based on the time it takes for you to select them. It seeks to get to your natural impulse without your reasoned thought. So in the case of like Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is the basis of much of our understanding on cognitive bias, it's trying to uncover your system one thinking. So system one thinking is extremely fast, has reference to pretty much your entire long-term memory, but is also extremely error prone. I like to think of it as like the pictures of operators back in the day where they have the little plug boards, this sort of thing. It's like trying to do that super, super fast, but it sometimes makes mistakes and plugs into the wrong place. Whereas your system two thinking, slower, more reasoning, it takes a whole lot more energy, and it can only really access your short-term memory, or primarily access your short-term memory, which can hold about 5 things, a handful of things in it. So this is part of that challenge, that just about how our brains fundamentally work. So unconscious bias.
Maybe if someone is listening now for the first time, system 1 and system 2 again. So most of the time we are thinking with system 1, right? Which is the kind of autopilot, we can say. We are on autopilot.
Yeah, so system one thinking, I mean, we're using both of them, but system one is the most active. So basically we take some sort of input from our senses, and immediately system one is like, okay, it's this, cool, you're done. We don't have to think about it anymore, moving on. And this is critically important because that's what keeps us thinking that big yellow cat that's coming our way, maybe we want to avoid it. It's the thing that is really core to our survival. And that's the system one thinking. And oftentimes system one thinking, well, the vast majority of the time it happens before any form of conscious thought. It's extremely fast. And this is the thinking fast part of Kahneman's book. The other one, system two thinking, is, all right, well, system one can't figure this out. So system two now needs to pick it up and work with it. And as some of the exercises I do in the class that you went through try to tease out is we all absolutely fall into that system one trap, whether or not we know about it. A classic experiment, which is a lot of fun, is you give the price of a bat and a ball, where the bat is €1 more than the ball, but together they come to €11. And then you ask the question, what's the price of the ball? Most people, when presented with that, will say that the ball clearly is €1. But that would make the combined price €12. The ball is actually 50 cents. So what's happening there? That's called attribute substitution bias. And what's happening there is you're presented with what seems like a very simple math problem. 11 minus 10 equals 1, right? Perfect. Makes sense. But that actually requires a bit deeper thought because the bat is €10 more than the ball. So in that case, you actually have to realize, oh, wait. So if it's €10 more, then and the ball were €1, then the bat would actually cost €11, which would make the total €12. So that requires actually deeper cognitive thinking. So it's not that the people who answer that the ball is €1 are dumb, it's that they're falling into attribute substitution bias. Now, the funny thing about this, and the reason I share this, is because I know the answer to that. I wrote the slides to show that to the class, to work through it. I am very well grounded in that. I still think the ball costs €1 half the time. My brain about me, like, oh, obviously it's this. It's not. So that's, again, speaking of another bias, is, what is it? Blind spot bias. Or maybe even the G.I. Joe bias, where it's like, oh, because I know about the bias, I'm not subject to them. Yeah, you are. You still are, because it's just the way our brains work.
Yeah, actually, if you were to ask me about the three biases, like the top three, I would say blind spot. So I like that you mentioned it also here.
Why does blind spot bias?
Why? Now what comes to my mind is knowledge is not enough. Like we can know a lot, we can read all the books in the world, but it's not only the knowledge, if is always how you take this knowledge and put it into practice. How you take this knowledge and to put it into practice, and then this changing the habit we were talking about.
Yeah.
I think this will help us more be aware of it, but it's not something that you have just to know about it.
Yeah.
Maybe there's another blind spots that I'm not aware of still.
Well, you bring that up. I changed the words just slightly and reference one of my favorite luminaries in my field. He's actually more lean manufacturing, but J. Edward Stimming, who said, information is not the same as knowledge. Let's not confuse the two. And I think it speaks to what you're talking about. As you learn about all these things, you're collecting information, which is great. You need that. But knowledge is, how do you apply that information in a meaningful way? And so there's some, and I know that's a very nuanced thing, but I think it's a really important thing. And I think you really touched on it there because, yeah, knowing about the biases, that's great. It helps you a lot. It doesn't protect you from it. And the other thing is, with the blind spot bias, is that whole thing of like, well, clearly other people are affected by bias, but not me. Of course not. And we all feel that way. We all want to be the main character in our story. We are, but that doesn't make us flawless. that doesn't make us any less subject to the things that are impacting everybody around us. Easy to forget that, though, in the moment.
There is another thing that I'm curious also to hear from you, also in like how you demystify these terms and put them into practice, which is the social identity theory. What is it in simple words?
The simplest thing is it is our instinct to form groups based around our identity and then compete within those groups. So we are highly social creatures. And we are also creatures who are by nature competitive. Having status within a group that we care about means a great deal to us. So we're going to try to find different ways to have status. And we will naturally form groups that we trust more so than other groups that we differ from, particularly when you're competing for resources. And one of the key ways to get status in your current group is to do something that impacts the group that impacts generally negatively that group who's competing for resources with you. So this is where it gets dangerous. And in the class, you may have noticed we intentionally steered very clear of any highly charged topics. We used examples like activities we enjoy, etc. And the reason for that is because this stuff gets deadly if it's not managed well. This stuff is kind of the foundation of much of the workings of the world. And while it's attractive to say we shouldn't hold a judgment over this group of people, blah, 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 it's core to our nature to do that.
Mm.
We just do that naturally. However, you have a choice. And what that choice is do you find a way to overcome some of the biases and such which are ingrained in us and maybe look at a different way, maybe find common ground with that person who's very different than you. To find common cause together and build bridges. And I think that's some of the stuff we really need going forward in this world is people getting really adept at that, finding common cause with those around us, whatever the things that divide us might possibly be.
And it's funny, you say sometimes even very, you can say silly things, can divide us. Like in the practice, what we did in the class was we split into 3 groups and each one chooses the color that he likes more or she likes more. Mm-hmm. And that was, if we go more deeper into it, maybe we would argue like about colors, right? And this is, it's just, and then you find reason just because you chose to take something with no reasoning, maybe, right? Or maybe also it maybe even colors can be related to some traumas, experiences, or things that you had in the past. Is it true?
Yeah, and I mean, Teufel, a guy by the name of Teufel, he was in the 1940s, I believe he was. He was Polish, lost family in the horrible events that occurred in Poland and Germany. And he was really kind of foundational in figuring out social identity theory. And he ended up doing these experiments with, I think they were like high school kids, that sort of thing, where you had them look at a bunch of dots on a page, and then he would tell them whether they estimated high or low. And then he would give them a little bit of money that they could choose to share with another person, where the only thing they knew about that other person was if they had estimated high or low, and found substantive results showing that they would be more likely to give money to somebody that was in the same form of estimator as they were, that they self-identified. So it was something that didn't matter. And in fact, the researchers wouldn't necessarily be honest about who estimated high or low. They just made sure they had a 50-50 split. So, but it was really about that self-identification. And here's a really core, important part of the whole idea of social identity theory. If I say, Omar, you're part of group red, you don't really care, right? But if you say, yeah, I chose red for my reasons, you start to get that sense that is your color. But it can also be things like there's a show that used to run called Brain Games. It was pretty fantastic. And they did one on social identity theory. And they had a red team and a blue team. The red team was representing everybody whose birthdays were in the first 6 months of the year. The other team was the latter 6 months of the year. And in doing that, people self-identified into the various groups, and they started caring more about the red team or the blue team. Why? They don't know these people. They don't really care about what's going on there. But it was still one of these, I identify as part of this group, therefore, and it's ingrained in us. Now, it's easy to see how it can go wrong, but it's also an incredibly powerful positive force if harnessed well.
Mm.
So that was one of the things. My interest in social identity started very, very, very early in my life, but I didn't know what it was called until well into my adulthood, and in fact, into my agile coaching practice. But I noticed things like we would have these scrum teams form, these agile teams form, and we would have them choose a team name. Heck, I was on those teams as a developer, and I remember how proud people were about, I'm on Team Walrus, I'm a walrus. Not really walruses, we're just nerds sitting there working together. But the thing about it is you start getting the sense of pride in your group. And of course, our team was better than this team over here. That's a given, right? So you start forming those things, but we're all working towards the same goal. All right, so why does this matter? Well, what that matters is I trust my walruses more than I trust people in the next team. So if the times get tough, we're going to pull together. We're going to work together really, really well. If I start getting pressure from another group, my group is going to help me. Now, the cool thing about Team Walrus was at Getty Images, and I was there for about 4 years. And that's where I really saw some of these group dynamics play out in really interesting ways. Largely positive, because we had a very strong identity and a very strong mission. And you start seeing this thing where you will always have intergroup rivalries, but competition is not necessarily negative, much like conflict. Competition can be positive. It's just you have to, of course, harness it towards working towards a common goal and supporting one another in getting to that goal. Another example about collective competition that I love is I was into sailboat racing for a while up in the Puget Sound. It was really fantastic time. And some people I know through sailboat racing had a particular type of boat that was a very competitive fleet. It's called a Moore 24. And if you were in Seattle and you bought a Moore 24 and you didn't know how to sail, this couple would come and sail with you. They tended to win most of the races. They are incredible racers. But they would sit there on your boat teaching you to sail your boat so you can compete against them in the future. And I talked to them about it. So what's going on there? And their response is, it's not fun to race against people who you can always beat. I want everybody to get better so it's more fun for everyone. So I love that story of collective competition because, yeah, they're competing. Yes, they want to win. But why do you want to win against somebody you could beat without your eyes closed? You want to win against real competition. So if you can build the same sort of perspective in business, where we want to win, but we also want to support the folks around us, I think you're onto something really powerful.
You reminded me of Simon Sinek while you were talking about this. Let me come back to first one. If we are talking about these simple stuff again, random dots or colors or wherever that or months, like just be born in September, for example, against March, that could separate us. So that explains very well why when you have supporting a different party, political party, especially when you choose to support one party, how you can be totally against someone else that you might not know just because he chose another one. Lots of conflicts inside countries and also between countries.
Yes.
And of course, we can have so many other examples here. But yeah, I think that was That's a different perspective. When you understand how silly things can separate us, then you understand why we have lots of separation in the world in bigger things.
What I would also say is also when groups split, like you mentioned, political parties. Let's use something, though, a lot more tame. So sports teams is a classic example. I know that footballers, with the world's definition of football, they can get kind of violent with one another in some cases, but in most cases, you look at a football team, you can tell at a glance which team they support. Or I'm sorry, a fan of a football team. You can tell at a glance who they support, right? Because they're wearing a scarf, they're wearing a jersey, they might have a little patch. They have all of these cultural totems, is one of the terms for it. All these indicators saying, I'm part of this group. They need to project that out. It shows status within the group, and it shows that sense of belonging. These things become a self-reinforcing thing, and then also helps, oh, well, you're wearing a different jersey than mine. I should not like you because you're supporting a rival team. So that's one of the ways I would help people see it is, hey, do you have a favorite sport? Great. Who's your favorite team? Okay. Who's their biggest rival? They say the name. It's like, all right, what do you think of their fans? And usually people catch on before I get here, to be quite honest. But if they don't, then, it's like, all right, but you love the same sport, don't you? So you have more in common than you have different. Yet you're so focused on those divisions. I think that's true of the vast majority of us. And just one last little bit, that is ultimately part of what causes class to come into existence. Was one of the things that frustrates me about being somebody who's heavily invested in sustainability, in human dignity, all this sort of stuff, is that a lot of us who share these same values tend to attack each other more than they attack the problems or groups in opposition. So we tend to be cross-purpose from one another because, hey, I'm not a vegan, I'm not even a vegetarian. But if there's people that I've interacted with where we have the vast majority, we both agree that sustainable energy is the right way to go, but they might not really want to have anything to do with me because I eat meat. Mm-hmm. So this sort of stuff gets in the way of real progress. And when I shared that with Thomas, he invited me to start working on this. Because ultimately what we need to come to is you probably have certain things in your life that I don't do. I'm not going to judge you for what you do in your life and how you choose to live your life. I trust you won't judge me on how I will. But we can work together towards this common goal. And, there's certain things that, sure, we should find common ways of working. If it's related to this goal, related to this thing, yeah, we need to come to agreement on things. But that shouldn't give me any cause to say, oh, well, you need to change the way you do this. Instead, let's focus on our common cause. And that's something I think those of us who are trying to make the world a lot kinder could really benefit from getting behind.
To be honest, I cannot promise you. From what I learned, from what I understood, but I do my best.
Hey, it's easier said than done. All of us.
The other thing is also, it was the last podcast. He was talking about competition, and he said competition is it was with Kevalia. He said competition is the reason why we have lots of greed and separation, etc. And he said competition is true in sport, and this is what you were talking about before. But in business, it's about collaboration. And he told me that I like to choose the word inspiration instead. So I see you having something unique. Yeah, I see you have something unique, Shayne. Then I want to get inspired by you. Then I see you in business. I don't see you as someone, as a rival. Then I see you as someone, okay, you do this very well. How can I work with you? How can I support you? So we both benefit from each other and can grow together. Yeah, Tim.
If I could chime in on it.
Yeah, of course.
So I haven't heard of that as co-opetition, and I'm a huge proponent of co-opetition because, if say you and I are working on a business in the same space, well, we might be targeting a different target market. we might have slight variations. Is there a way that my business can help support your business in doing well? It's the mindset of plenty as opposed to scarcity. And the mindset of plenty tends to find better alignments. And yeah, we should compete with one another as two different businesses, but I should also feel comfortable with somebody comes to me and I realize you can serve them better than I can, I should send them to you, and vice versa. Because that person's going to have a far better experience when you're better aligned. And chances are, if I have an offering that's going to resonate with them, they'll also become my customer. They're going to trust me a little bit more. So it's a really important mindset, and it's about, as Seneca talks about infinite game, it's infinite game theory as opposed to closed game, fixed game theory. So we need to really embrace that infinite game. We need to find ways to embrace co-opetition and find a way to lift as many of us up as possible. So I think I agree with your guest. Yeah, we might use different words, but ultimately we have to build an ecosystem is what it comes right down to. It's not any of us standing alone. It has to be a mutually supportive ecosystem for us to get out of the mess we're in.
And Shayne, before we go to the next question, if you like to expand even more on how to harness and how to benefit, let's say, from the social identity theory, when we understand the separation, or how can we be separated because of how we define ourselves, let's say. Do you like to share also another story or an example?
Well, I'm going to go back to the same financial services company that I was talking about, because it's such a wonderful story. I was working with these guys for that group. I think I was working with for about 2 or 3 years. So I got to see them evolve from this group that did not have a home sort of thing. They were nomads in various offices throughout the building. This was in person. I did stay attached to them through COVID as well. But at that point, I was more hands-off. But anyway, a funny thing about that is part of their identity was that shared adversity when they started. But ultimately, what it came down to was continually reinforcing the shared mission. And the thing that was really key about how that was done was it wasn't leadership saying, this is why you should care about this, which is what a lot of companies do. Instead, it was leadership inviting people to share why they cared about it. And this is a really important thing. This goes back to that whole thing of you must self-select into a group. These folks, it was a business situation, so they didn't largely select into their group. So in that case, you have to do a whole lot more work to get them to have a sense of belonging. And we were actually pretty darn intentional about it. There's a wonderful book, one of my favorites, called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. And it gives a nice little structure of how to do that. And we reference that. In fact, I insisted that all the leadership read it because we wanted to make sure we went into this very, very aware. And so the shared adversity, that was a huge benefit for us in a weird sort of way, because now we had a common struggle. And having a form of a crisis the team can rally around is a really good way to build bonds. Other stuff we would do would be, one of my counterparts, she would regularly do group birthdays. And it was like, okay, all the birthdays for March. It wasn't an individual's birthday. It was kind of a collective thing where we all got to celebrate together. They would throw really good parties, really entertaining parties. Some of them, they'd say, hey, bring your family in. Some of them, it'd be more just your coworkers. They would do various different things to get to know each other better. We all had to do it very uncomfortable. This wasn't my idea. In fact, I was not thrilled about it when I had to do it, but it turned out to be a great thing. We had to do these write-ups about who we are, like what professional skills do we bring? What's our core vision? What do we care about? What is our work experience? And these were plastered all over space, along with quotes from our customers saying, our customers like, this was the best experience. Also metrics and ways to say, hey, things aren't going quite how we want them to. How do we get better? We intentionally built the space where people identified as part of this effort, and we surrounded it with essentially the same thing as those scarves and jerseys are for a sports team. But for our stuff that said, hey, you belong here. This is yours. And as we continue to reinforce that message, people started caring more about it. It became one of those things where you give them like gear with the logo on it and they would proudly wear it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can start to build this sense of community. But another key aspect is you had to show people that they truly belong there and that their efforts mattered and their perspective mattered.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say that there wasn't conflict. There was conflict within the teams, conflicts between the teams, conflicts within the entire organization. It was not all, sunshine, roses, and puppies. It was definitely some challenging things to work through. So an important aspect when you're leading a group like that is you need to gently coax it along. You have to continue to reinforce the right things, continue to manage the conflicts and the challenges. But what it did was that group ended up delivering some software or some functionality on the site that was highest rated of anything, and from a demographic who generally didn't trust technology. It was a really strong offering, and the VP who was in charge of it ended up getting promoted up to an SVP. They had a whole lot of ranks in this company, but it was basically just underneath the executive at a 30,000 plus person company. So it has very real life effects. Pretty much everybody touched by that, carrying it with them to some degree or another. Unfortunately, as I understand, the initiative did get shut down eventually, but the time that it ran, it was highly successful.
What initiatives have you personally experienced that makes you or made you more compassionate and present at work?
It's hard to choose just one. One of the things that was probably a big factor was I started my career in customer service. My first real job was at Kinko's Copy Center. And Kinko's, which may sound kind of strange, but Kinko's, part of their brand was about providing excellent customer service. So they had pretty strict training about de-escalation. They had training about, how do you actually understand your customers' needs? Because believe it or not, working for a copy center that's trying to, put together presentations and things like that, it's actually a high conflict zone. So you would have somebody who they're trying to get funding and they brought in a presentation that happened to get torn up by the copier. They're not going to be very happy about that sort of situation. And this was also, laser printers were a new thing at the time, to give an idea of the era. But that helped instill in me some foundational skills on de-escalation, on seeking to relate with people. Now, that's come to the surface off and on throughout my career. As an engineer, you end up learning to stand your ground a whole lot more because you have to argue your point, etc. So some of those honestly went to the wayside. But then as an Agile coach, I had to dust that back off in a really big way. And I still struggle with it from time to time. It's an ongoing thing, and all of this is a lifelong mission to get really good at it. You're going to be either better or worse, and that's where that self-reflection that I'm always encouraging comes in so strong and so important. As I understand it, emotional intelligence is primarily made up of two parts: self-awareness and social awareness. So how well do you see how you come across to others, and how well can you reflect on your own actions and determine how you present yourself in the world? Did you present yourself the way you wanted to? So with those two things together, building your EQ can continue to grow that way. So in my case, my self-awareness has always been pretty strong to the point of self-consciousness at times. My social awareness took some rework as I got more into coaching.
Mm. So that was something that you practically enhanced, let's say, or became more aware of through the coaching, the social aspect, and the personal aspect was more of a personal reflection.
have a conversation that didn't go the way you wanted it to. It's like, oh God, what did I say? How did that happen? I think it was probably desperately trying to be more socially aware, but not having the toolbox at the time. But once I got into coaching, I was exposed to a lot more people who were highly developed in that. I worked for some pretty sizable consulting firms, not the big five, but the biggest pure play agile consultancy, I think in the world, definitely in the United States for a while. So I got to work with some phenomenal coaches and got some really good training. And, how do you get out of your own head and start thinking about what's going on for other people? And that ended up reinforcing some of the stuff that I had started exploring from curiosity, such as social identity theory. Funny thing about my background in bias, though, I credit a lot of that to my former housemate, who was working on her PhD in behavioral psychology when we lived together. She was studying bias against addicted people and healthcare professionals. That's what her doctorate was on. She really introduced me to the concept of biases. And I remember asking pretty much the same questions that I hear from a lot of people. It's like, well, then you got to prevent them, right? It doesn't work that way. And now I find myself basically saying the same thing that she was telling me back then to other people. So it's been a journey, and I know it will continue to be a journey, and it continues to take practice. But the key is to be reflective of your own behavior, but also cut yourself some slack. Don't beat yourself up about it, but also really try to learn how other people see you, how you come across to others, because there is no way you can see how you are in someone else's eye. Only they can tell you. But you have to be able to foster a honest dialogue to get to that.
And not to take the feedback personally, right?
That's key. It's hard. That's easier said than done.
Yeah.
As well. Yet another one. I mean, I can't say I'm perfect at that. My wife and I will sometimes battle over such things. But, when it comes right down to it, yeah, you got to be as objective as possible. Remind yourself that this person sharing the feedback with you is trying to do some from a place of care in most cases, hopefully. And from there, another important thing is not everything that they see necessarily does apply. That's just their perspective. Now, discount it. Understand its information, but it doesn't also set the entire truth. They're just seeing a different part of the elephant, or feeling a different part of the elephant.
Do you feel inspired by this conversation? If that's the case, please share that with me, write me a comment, and share it with a friend that you know will benefit from this podcast. Core Impact Podcast is on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all other major platforms. I would like to ask some questions now about the future of work. And the first one is, what is the biggest challenge or the biggest few challenges that you see that CEOs and companies are underestimating when we talk about the future?
I can't say that I'm in the head of many CEOs and COOs and such entirely, but there are a couple of things that I've observed that seem to be tripping them up. There's, of course, the extreme level of volatility, but I think that's pretty clear for a lot of people to see right now. The hiring market, just the world in general is in a highly volatile state right now. We are in challenging times right now, and I think that folks are aware of that. Some things that I think that we're seeing a lot in the press where people can be misguided is, while AI is an impressive tool, generative AI is a very impressive tool, it is not to the level that a lot of people are crediting it to. The more I work with it in various work I'm doing, including development and writing, the more I see that it makes a lot of mistakes. And these are the most advanced ones the most advanced consumer ones we're working with, they're not particularly bright. And more often than not, I'm having to correct it. In fact, the more I work with it, the more I find myself arguing with it. And I'm guessing a lot of people are having this experience. But this was something I just learned about today, as a matter of fact, where an insurance company is having the team enter information that will be used by an AI to make decisions. This is really scary because AI is very good at approximation. It is not good at specific, deterministic decision making. And a classic example is gave it a value of, hey, X number of pages plus or minus 10%. It came back with, say, with a completely different margin, X number of pages plus or minus 30%. That's not at all what it said. And in fact, I know for a fact that's not what I had told it. However, it was just sort of pulling together various different numbers, putting it together in a way that seemed okay. But even though it's convincing that it is a reasoning device, it is not. AI does not understand what it's churning out. It's just putting together patterns. So that's one of the things. Now, going back to your question about CEOs, et cetera, future work, I think AI will get there, but probably maybe in our lifetimes. It's not there yet. So companies that are doing things like NVIDIA's CEO, oh, we're getting rid of developers. Developer time is done. That's not going to go well for them. So I think there's this over-reliance on AI and the flashiness of it. And this is yet another bubble, much like the dot-com bubble was a bubble. It is transformative technology without a doubt, but it's not quite to the level that people are giving it credit for. So that's another one. Here's another one, and this one's a bit more abstract. The mental model of many companies in the world is very much mechanistic by nature. It generally is coming out of the industrial era, where essentially companies would function like machines. People in the company were an interchangeable cog that, you swap it out. You could thank Ford for that with the production line. That's truly, I thought of the workers. There was also Winslow Taylor, who did scientific management in the 1800s, who really did view workers as essentially interchangeable cogs. These principles is what a lot of modern business is based on. And this is why you start seeing things in, say, the hiring market and mass layoffs, all these kind of, I want to say toxic practices, but let's just say less than ideal practices you see in the market. Well, the reality is organizations are actually complex adaptive systems, which means they resemble more of an ecosystem or an organism than they do a machine. And what I mean by this is with a machine, you can optimize little parts of it. Obviously, you want to optimize the whole, but you can take it apart and then put it back together, and it will generally work reasonably well. But with an organism, you can't take out the liver and just swap it out. You could try, but it generally doesn't go particularly well. If one part of the organism isn't functioning well, or perhaps even over-functioning, it can damage other parts. A classic example of allergies are your immune system overreacting to a stimuli. So you want your immune system to do that job when it's the right thing, but by it being overactive, it now can be damaging and even fatal to the organism. As such, if you look at a company as an organism or an ecosystem rather than a machine, if you're viewing it as a machine, making more sales is a good thing because it's more input going into the machine, right? The machine can work better. If you look at it as an organism, what does that additional sales mean to the rest of the fulfillment? What does that do to the rest of the company as a whole? Maybe sales needs to be on a relatively even trajectory so that the entire organism can do well. And I think one of the key things we're going to see as companies start experimenting with things like holacracy, et cetera, is people taking on a more systems-oriented view. This is actually a hopeful thing. People take on more of a systems-oriented view of companies and understand how all of these pieces fit together. Now, really quick, are you familiar with complex adaptive systems, or do you want me to give a very high-level summary for the listeners?
Yes, of course. Yeah, you can always you can demystify so people can understand.
Yeah, happy to. So complex adaptive systems is a field of science right now. Some of the classic examples of complex adaptive system you can observe are a school of fish or a flock of birds. And in a complex adaptive system, like a flock of birds, there's no lead bird in most cases, or no lead fish in a school of fish. What it is a whole bunch of individuals within this group that are all operating under a very simple set of rules, which each of those individuals affect the overall group of individuals. So with the school of fish, we'll just use that. With a school of fish, they want to stay together. They want to not bump into their neighbor and go match speed and direction largely. All right. So what happens here? Oh, and avoid predators, of course. That's very important. So what happens here? Well, maybe a fish in this thing sees a predator coming. So it's like, hey, I'm going to avoid that predator. Well, that means that fish is going to practically or run the risk of bumping into the fish next to him, which will turn to avoid, follow its simple rule, and so forth. They may not even see the predator. But this sets off a chain reaction, which splits the school of fish into two, so the shark swims right through it with only a few stragglers in its mouth. So this is the nature of a complex adaptive system, is each individual agent within the complex adaptive system has a set of very simple rules that it generally follows. And through that ends up affecting the entire set of these agents, the collective, which in turn shapes the behavior of the individual. So it's this feedback loop. So why does this matter in business? Well, we humans are always in complex adaptive systems, whether we realize it or not. You can observe this on a crowded street, at crosswalks, and how do you navigate through a crowd? What does that look like? What are the patterns that form? What are the simple rules you're continually following? These rules are not always physical, though. And this is where it goes into the class and what we've largely been talking about. Some of these rules are also psychological and social psychological. So how do you shape these rules to help manifest the behavior you want? So that's what we're really working with. And I think a positive future of work is people being able to harness that to shape these complex adaptive systems for every gathering of humans towards a meaningful goal. So I told you it was abstract, but I'm hoping that we got to the essence of it.
And I like the analogy also that you gave. So let's say stay now a bit in the future, and from your view, what are the most important 3 core skills that especially change makers should have in the future?
Well, number one is collaboration. Being able to connect and collaborate really readily and find partnerships, I think is probably the most important, because none of us can do this on our own. Another very related one is perspective taking. And this goes to empathy. Try to understand where others are coming from. And I guess it could be argued that's also part of the first one. But I'll just say they're tightly related, because it's not easy to view somebody, especially if you're having a, say, contentious conversation with them, as a fully formed human who is working to work through the same challenges you're working through. It's very easy to lose sight of that. I think humility, which may be a strange one, but ultimately, the understanding that you're probably wrong. Something in your view is probably not accurate. And through that humility, foster a sense of curiosity of trying to find what that is. So in the class, I mentioned the work of Dan Kahan, and he's a Yale professor, and his work is really based around understanding how people understand data. And one of the things that he learned was the more educated people were in science and data interpretation, called quantitative literacy, the more subject they were to their pre-existing biases. And this is really depressing stuff because that's shaping our elections, that's shaping our views on, well, it goes back to confirmation bias, doesn't it? So this is all really tightly intertwined and it's a mess. But he did find one group that was not subject to this effect of the more education in science and quantitative literacy, the more subject they were to the bias. And that group were the science curious, were the people who actually love to learn for learning's sake. They didn't go into it with an agenda. They went into it saying, what is really going on here? They're fascinated by the topics. We need to find that almost childlike fascination, even on things that we care deeply about. Of course, as Kahan says, easier said than done.
Another one about the future. Imagine we are in 2035. How would the workplace be if all leaders led from their core? They were purpose-driven, they were compassionate. How would it be?
So the utopian vision is what we're going for. Well, first up, I would think that people would generally embrace a working environment that works for them. So if remote work for them, they'd be working remotely primarily. If going in the office worked for them, they'd have a place they could go and focus. The groups would come together regularly. And that's why I said primarily remote. FaceTime is really important. That's one of the ways we humans build bonds. But it would be something like quarterly or twice a year, something of that effect. And it would be really oriented around connecting and building those communal bonds. Ultimately, people would be supported in their moment in life. Now, a key perspective that I like to adopt and has been true in my life is that work isn't a destination. Instead, it is a step on a learning journey. And I would think that these sorts of organizations would embrace that concept. Now, it may be that you're on that step in your learning journey for the rest of your life. That's great. If you continue to learn at work at a rapid pace, wonderful if it's fulfilling you. But the work should not be the definition of the human. And in the US, unfortunately, that tends to be the case. Instead, the work should be an enhancement to your life that allows you to feel like you're contributing to something. And this is going to be a key aspect of this whole thing. We need everybody to feel like my work matters. Something I would often ask people, my clients, would be, what is the good that the work you're doing does for the world? What is the thing you believe is important about this work? And if somebody is working something client-facing, they're generally able to answer that pretty easily. But if it's a deeper system, like, I don't know, security compliance, that might be a little harder at a financial services organization. That might be a lot harder to answer. And I legitimately had that conversation. But if you actually stop and you think about it, what does that security compliance person do? Well, it protects all of the customers from losing their assets. That's a pretty big good in the world, right? It makes sure that their customers can trust the clients. The reason I bring this whole thing up is the criticality of the individual within an organization being attached to the true purpose of their work. Why does their work matter? And through that, if you can actually feel like your work matters, it doesn't really feel like work. It feels like you're solving interesting problems with your buddies. And that is a very fulfilling way to work. And it will also do a collective societal good, because imagine how much better people would feel coming home and interacting with their families after working all day on something they actually were passionate and cared about.
Mm.
As well as their communities, of course.
I love the way you said this in the end. It's not only what you said, it's also how you said it, like your energy while you're saying it, you know. You feel it. Yeah. And that's something also, to be honest, before jumping to the next question, is discovering more through these discussions. It was for me in the beginning, like let's say few years ago especially, purpose was something like kind of spiritual, purpose at work is like, you want to do good only, or something like, I want to be a good person kind of. But what actually purpose is just like really be yourself, know yourself, and know what service can you give to others, how can you benefit others, and in this way you are happy and people are happy, and everything is different than how, and you can also get the benefit, financial benefit, whatever you say, and it all goes very smoothly and effortlessly.
Let me summarize real quick what I understood. You were expressing that when you first learned about purpose, you thought of it almost more of a spiritual thing as opposed to, and now you've gained this understanding that it is more about how can you serve others, and through that have this generative, beneficial cycle in serving a broader than others, including financial. And I think that's a really important insight because ultimately it is really about service to others. How do you help make the world a little bit better? And purpose can be derived from spirituality. That's fine for some folks, but I don't think that it's only the domain for that. And in fact, there's also many folks that has nothing to do with their sense of purpose. I think it transcends a lot of the groups, etc. It's more along the lines of how do you play a part in making the world a little bit better, and where can you fit? And one of the things I also want to point out is it's entirely reasonable that my purpose is for the well-being of this particular type of bird. It doesn't interact with people at all, but it still makes the world a little bit better because this type of bird may have a chance of filling out its ecological niche or surviving or something to that effect. So purpose doesn't necessarily have to be tied to other people. It could be, but it should be tied to something bigger than yourself. And I think that's the key. And I'm just sort of thinking through this right now, is if your only purpose is to serve yourself, that's not good. That's not going to lead to good stuff. And unfortunately, we see entirely too much of that in the world. However, if your real purpose is serving others and truly understanding others' needs, whether those others are humans or ecosystem or something else, then you might be able to get to a better place and then find a real grounding in purpose. And if you're working towards your purpose and if it's aligned to your values, then it's highly energizing work.
What is your call to action for professionals who want to make a change but don't know how to start with the first step?
Great question. Probably what we had you do in the class. Start really dig into how our brains work in that regard. And the reason for that is by understanding biases, you start understanding some of the impulses you may not know you had. You start understanding how you come at things. After that, I would say really dig deep into empathy. I'm not talking, again, going back to Chris Voss, their definition on empathy, which is not, oh, I feel what you feel, but instead, I understand where you're coming from. And start really learning to do that, because the key is to really relate with the other person and try to understand things from their perspective. And the best is when they know you understand from their perspective. Once you have those two things in place, you might be able to start making some positive results. Another aspect that is tied to the cognitive bias is, of course, social identity theory. Understand how group dynamics work. And one thing I'll share, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this because it's based on one of our first interactions. I asked the class a question about how much do you think your group influences you? And I remember your answer. And at the time, you didn't think it influenced you much. And one of the things that I find so fascinating, particularly being an expat living in Portugal from the United States, is it becomes a lot clearer how much your group really does influence you. and I'm sure you've experienced that, you're an expat as well, in ways that you don't even realize. In fact, in most cases, you're completely blind to until you actually start to look. So one of my favorite metaphors for this that's getting a lot more traction is culture is like atmosphere or air, that you don't really notice it until you experience a major change, and you can acclimatize yourself to a new culture. But it always takes some adjustment period. And it may never quite fit. If I went to Greenland, for instance, I probably would never be quite comfortable with it there. Maybe after a few years. But I'm not a huge fan of extreme cold. So it's really important to understand where the other person is coming from, understand that they're operating with a different set of ideas of what normal is than you do. There's a thing called the Overton window. And this is very closely tied to social identity theory. The Overton window is the window that defines what is normal. And as your group starts doing things, and oftentimes internal competition for status does this, your Overton window moves. And that can start a group that's relatively innocuous, maybe has some strong views, can turn them extremist over time. Because the Overton window keeps shifting and moving along, where the people who were once core to the group become the outliers on the less extreme side, and the more extreme start pushing the group in a competition for status. And this is observable throughout all of human history, up to and including the modern day.
And that could be used also for the benefit of humanity, or could be driven to somewhere totally different. Now I'm giving you the space to give your final words.
What we talked about today, it often makes people uncomfortable, and it is an intense topic that requires a lot of thought. However, it's also something that is fundamental to the bedrock of all of human society. So it's something we can't shy away from. We have to work towards understanding it. Ultimately, the key is find common purpose with those around you. Find a way that you can collaborate together towards your common goals. Try to find ways to de-escalate tensions if possible, and find ways to make the world a little bit better. Because ultimately, the vast majority of us want exactly the same things. We want our families to do well. We want to do well. We want to be able to support ourselves. We want to do something that we care about. So how do we find common cause to support those things as opposed to conflicts to prove our group is better than this group or whatever?
Shayne, I'm really grateful, and there were lots of impulses you gave during the conversation, and I think that the topics you talked about are really, really important. This is, by the way, I'm really enjoying the whole conversation, and I know it might not be easy for some maybe to grasp, but because it's important, I couldn't stop just asking you. This is, by the way, the longest podcast I've been doing in English, at least so far, but I really couldn't stop being curious to know from you more and delve into these topics. And I liked a lot how many authors, books, and quotes you mentioned, like you were citing the whole time from references while you were speaking. So this is something I also appreciate. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best, Shayne.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. Hopefully the message got through.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and to follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and all other major platforms. Enjoy every moment. Until next time.